Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum. Tonight, we want to take an opportunity to reflect on the November 2018 midterm elections, to get past the initial barrage of headlines and take a deeper dive into important short-term and long-term implications of the midterms so we can all be better and more informed and more engaged citizens. Our moderator today is Shaniqua McClendon, and our guest speakers are John Favreau and Candice Mallet. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with support from Andy and Branya Galiff. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and please note that video and audio recording aren't allowed, but we are videotaping this and we'll make it available on our website in case you want to share it with your friends and family. I also want to mention a few upcoming Hammer programs you might be interested in. On January 31st, we have another Hammer Forum called Voting Rights and Wrongs, where we'll talk about voter suppression and mismanagement of polling places in the last elections, as well as the future of voting rights in America and the future of election laws and the new legal reforms designed to eliminate barriers to voting. On February 3rd, we'll be talking about the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. We have the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, who was the ambassador on 9/11. He's going to be one of our speakers. Unfortunately, I just found out that's the Super Bowl, so I don't know if that's an issue or not. Who knows? On March 3rd, we have a really interesting program about gerrymandering, and we're going to go deep into North Carolina as like the ultimate case study on gerrymandering. So that's going to be really interesting. And then on March 19th, we're doing a Hammer Forum on the growing YIMBY movement that's coming up as a counter to the NIMBY people. So those are all upcoming Hammer Forums. Also on February 5th, we're doing a program called Speaking Truth to Power, From Thomas to Kavanaugh. And we will have Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law scholar and was on Anita Hill's legal team. She's going to be speaking with Rebecca Traister, and we'll also, as part of that program, screen the documentary about Anita Hill. So enough about that. We also have all kinds of other programs, including poetry readings. We're having Wikipedia editing workshops. We're having live music, all kinds of things. So check out the Hammer calendar and come back. Admission is always free. And now on to today's program. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we're going to get started. As you probably all know, John Favreau is the co-host of one of the most popular podcasts in the world, Pod Save America, which has 1.5 million listeners every episode. Lots of fans in the audience. He also hosts a podcast called The Wilderness about the history and future of the Democratic Party. Both podcasts are produced by the media platform called Crooked Media, which Favreau co-founded in 2017. And before that, he served as Barack Obama's head speechwriter from 2005 to 2013. So you can thank him for that. Candice Mallet is a senior political editor at the digital media platform Blavity.com. She tracks national and international politics and its relationship to Black people in America. Mallett also explores topics like technology, global resistance, and fascism as an activist and a writer. Shaniqua McClendon is our moderator tonight. She's the political director for Crooked Media. At Crooked Media, she led the creation of their midterm voter engagement program, Vote Save America. She's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she earned her master's in public policy. During her studies, she also worked at Facebook on their politics and government outreach team. Prior to grad school, she worked in various capacities on Capitol Hill, starting off as an intern in the Obama administration. Then she was staff assistant to Senator Kay Hagan and went on to serve as legislative director for Congresswoman Alma S. Adams. So tonight we're going to first get a brief summary of the November 2018 midterm election results from Shaniqua to bring everybody up to speed, and then she's going to moderate a roundtable discussion with John Favreau and Candice Mallet about all the myriad important things that came out of the midterms. So please join me in welcoming Shaniqua McClendon.
Hi, everyone. Okay, we'll get started now. First, thank you to everyone for coming out today. So as Claudia just mentioned, right after my presentation, we're going to jump into a very interesting conversation with John and Candice. But before we do that, I'm just going to get everyone get everyone in the same space about some of the big headlines that we saw during the midterms. And during the discussion, we're going to dive into those headlines and see how we got to the outcomes of the election and what some of the larger implications of those are. So the biggest headline out of the midterms were that Democrats where that Democrats took back the House. And Democrats only needed to flip 23 seats to take back the House, but they ended up flipping 40 of them. And so now Democrats have enough of a majority in the House to do all the things that voters wanted them to do, holding Donald Trump accountable and splitting our government so that one party's not in control of everything. There is still one district that is being decided in North Carolina, the 9th District, trying to figure out some alleged voter fraud that happened there. But they might not figure that out until, I think it might be as late as the fall when they even have the primary election, so that seat is just going to remain open till then. For North Carolina, that is a big deal, but overall for Democrats, they are well over 218 seats, so they're good to go. Oh, okay. So with the 40 seats that were flipped, California played a huge role in flipping the House. These districts you can see here, there were 4 districts in Orange County that flipped. But those were just 4 of the districts in California that Hillary Clinton won, but were still represented by Republicans. So in total, California was able to flip 7 seats, which was about a third of the seats necessary to take back the House. So unlike in other times when California is just the place where politicians come to get money, voters actually were able to make a difference in flipping the House. So that's a good thing. I don't know, what am I supposed to point this? Sorry, guys. Okay, so a lot of new faces showed up in the House this January after the November elections. And so I guess I can name all these people. So we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who she didn't flip a seat, but was able to beat out an incumbent during the primary and has really made a name for herself, frankly, since she won, but now that she's on the Hill, has brought a lot of attention to issues. We have Lauren Underwood from Illinois, Andy Kim from New Jersey, Deb Haaland from New Mexico, who's actually one of 2 women who are the first Native American women to serve in the House, Katie Porter and Katie Hill, who are both from California, Colin Allred from Texas, who actually beat out Pete Sessions, who was the chair of the Rules Committee, which is a big deal. Rashida Tlaib, who is one of the first Palestinian woman to serve in the House, and Antonio Delgado, and Lucy McBath, who was able to flip the Georgia 6, which John Ossoff got close, but Lucy was able to close the deal this year. And so within this group, you can see that there are a lot of women, a lot of people of color, and amongst all of the new Democrats that came in, there are more that identify as part of the LGBTQ community. So we're going to dive into what it means to have these different types of Democrats under one party, and what does that mean for Nancy Pelosi as she's trying to manage her entire caucus. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button, sorry. Okay, so on the within the Senate, Republicans were able to increase their majorities there. So during the conversation, we're going to discuss how is it that Democrats were able to have such large gains in the House, but on the Republican side, on the Senate side, Republicans were able to increase their margins by 2 seats. Okay, increase their margins by 2 seats. But even though they were able to flip 4 seats, it was kind of a mixed bag for Republicans. They were able to flip 4 seats, but they also, I did that on purpose. They were able to they were able to flip 4 seats, but Democrats also were able to flip 2 seats, so they had a net gain of just 2 seats, which is still a big deal considering you no longer need 60 votes to pass judicial nominees, including the Supreme Court. So them having that cushion, given Murkowski and Collins kind of always being on, well, more so Murkowski being on the fence, that gives them a bit more of a cushion. But they also lost Dean Heller in Nevada, and, well, Flake wasn't running, but a Democrat still took his seat. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but overall, Republicans won out in the Senate. So moving on to the state level, Democrats also did well in gubernatorial races. They were able to pick up 7 seats, and they actually were able to oust Scott Walker, who for a long time was someone that the Republican Party elevated, especially after he tried to take union or collective bargaining away from unions in Wisconsin. And so a Democrat was able to take his place. Overall, there were 7 seats. So you look at Maine, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and Michigan, of course, being a state, Wisconsin and Michigan being states that Trump won. And so those went the other way. Kansas as well, which Democrats won there. It could have been because Chris Kobach was the Republican nominee, but nonetheless, Democrats won out there. Alaska was the only state that flipped, but Democrats were not in control of that governor's mansion. It was actually an independent, but an independent who was probably more to the left than to the right. Going one step down, Democrats also did well in state legislatures. They were able to gain full control of 5 state legislatures. And in Minnesota, they were able to take over the House, giving them a split legislature. And they also have a Democratic governor in Minnesota, so that gives Democrats more control over the overall state government, allowing them to advance more progressive policies. And overall, this is important, especially as we go into 2020, but 2018 and 2020, the elections that happen in state legislatures have a big impact on redistricting. So for whichever party wants to have control over that process, these elections are really important, especially layered on with places like Colorado, who now have a trifecta. Again, Alaska was the opposite, and they actually flipped their House to Republican, and so now they have the governor's house and both chambers. So one other thing that was on the ballot this, every election, but this election as well, were ballot initiatives. And we saw across the country a lot of voters were able to vote directly on the policies that they wanted to implement. One that was really popular, even outside of Florida, was Florida's Amendment 4, which restored voting rights for returning citizens who were formerly incarcerated. And that actually needed 60% of voter support, and it was able to pass, which is also interesting given you might assume that's a more progressive policy, but Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis won out there. So we'll talk about that some. But you also have states like Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah that passed Medicaid expansion. So going around their legislatures and putting in place the policies that they wanted to see. We also had some conservative ballot measures pass. So in Arkansas and North Carolina, voters voted to require voters to have voter identification when they voted. And in Alabama and West Virginia, they passed ballot measures that pretty much codified into their constitutions that a woman will never have a right to abortion, and that's in case the Supreme Court strikes down Roe v. Wade. They have made it perfectly clear that you have no options in that state for abortion. But also, and again, Arkansas, red state, they were one of the states that Arkansas and Missouri actually increased their minimum wage. So this is, again, another example of voters going around their legislature to put in place progressive policies, but not necessarily voting for Democrats. Claire McCaskill lost in Missouri while a minimum wage increase passed. So we're going to get into some of those dynamics and try to understand how did all of this happen in one election. And I just wanted to highlight these candidates because they had a ton of headlines throughout the election. A lot of Democrats wanted them to win. A lot were realistic about their chances, but nonetheless, these were tough losses that were still in the headlines after. Stacey Abrams' campaign went on just because of all of the voter suppression that was going on in Georgia for Andrew Gilliam. He went into a recount because it was so close, and they were also having issues. And Beto and Stacey especially. Well, no, all three of them came very close. O'Rourke and Abrams actually were able to do better statewide than a lot of other Democrats in their state. So even though these three candidates lost, they also inspired a lot of people to get involved, to vote, and quite frankly, we're still talking about them. So we'll talk about them today and how they fit into the larger equation. And finally, the last point I want to hit on is turnout. Turnout was a lot higher than it had been in other midterms. And so this year, it was at almost 50% at 49%, which in 2014, turnout in the last midterms was about 37%, which had been the lowest in about 70 years. So we're going to dig into that. Why were people excited to vote this time? Were they upset at Trump? Were there a bunch of organizations knocking on their door every day and trying to get them to vote? Or are people just starting to understand what role they play in their democracy? So that's kind of where I want to set the scene. And now we're going to invite John and Kandist up so we can have a conversation on all of it. Okay, I'm almost done doing all the talking, so this is good. So can you give one more round of applause to our guest for today? So my first question is very easy. What were you watching before election night? What were you paying attention to? And then after election night happened, thinking specifically on Tuesday, how did you feel when the night ended?
I'll take that first.
Go for it.
Yeah. So for the midterms, I think we all kind of got swept in by like the possibility, like the excitement of having, Black governors for the first time in states like Maryland, Georgia, and Florida. And so for someone who might have felt sort of disengaged by the electoral process before, there were so many new candidates that definitely made it more exciting. And so I think I was definitely, paying attention to those candidates, paying attention to just like the fresh energy of just like voting was almost cool again. And so, yeah.
I was terrified for an entire month, 2 months. I remember, in October, we were on the road a lot because we were doing live shows, and I just remember it was a really bad series of headlines in October, if we remember, because first we had sort of Kavanaugh and the Kavanaugh fallout, and then right as Kavanaugh was confirmed, we went right into caravan stuff for another 3 weeks, and then there were pipe bombs. I mean, it was quite an October. So I was going to be terrified of 2018 no matter what because of what happened in 2016, right? So I spent the weeks leading up to 2018 like obsessively checking every poll, as you know. You saw me in the office do this, obsessively checking every poll. But I was, and then starting to look at the early vote, even though you tell people the early vote can only tell you so much about what's going to happen. But I was specifically looking at, certainly those big three races that you talked about, Beto's race, Abrams' race, and specifically Florida. I was looking at because while I really wanted Beto and Stacey Abrams to win, I knew that Texas and Georgia are both really hard states to pull that off in. Florida, to me, is a state that Democrats, can win. It's always a close state, but Barack Obama won it in 2008, again in 2012. And we have this like really exciting, inspirational, very progressive candidate in Andrew Gilliam, and the public polls showed him with a fairly comfortable lead, even though public polling in Florida is garbage. But you think, like, you know, if they get him up 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like maybe he wins by 1 or 2. So, and then I remember as I started to look at some of the early vote coming in Florida, I started getting a little nervous. So I was sort of terrified about Florida specifically when we got to election night, which didn't make the first part of election night too great.
Right. And so after, we didn't see the final results of all of the midterms for probably a few weeks. So on election night, with what we had in, and even the next morning, the media saying, oh, there was no blue wave, there was no rebuke of Donald Trump. Is that how you felt? Or were you like, no, I know more's coming, it's gonna be better, there's gonna be something else happening?
Well, for us over at Blavity, we focus mostly on just like coverage for like young Black millennials. And so I know the night for election, you know, it was really exciting for us because it was the first time that, you know, we were covering an election. And I remember us watching it, you know, we had all the different like cable news on, and seeing when we left, like, you know, Beto was up, Gilliam was up, Abrams up, and we're like, okay, we should probably go home and finish working. Literally took me 15, 20 minutes to get home, and Gilliam had conceded, O'Rourke had conceded, and I was like, what happened? You know, like, what happened in that Uber ride? And I honestly, like, I felt very much like, why did they concede so early? And then I remember staying up and then watching Stacey's speech and feeling like, yes, I'm so happy she wasn't just like, oh, I'm conceding, because that was just such a bad, you know, it was just, you know, we were paying attention to like all the voter suppression that was happening all day. And that was just, or alleged voter suppression that was happening all day. Yeah. And so that was just really tough. And so, yeah, the next day, just kind of like sitting in all that. And
Yeah.
I think there were like 3 phases for me. So the first one was when, because I remember the first results that started coming in were Florida, which was started looking closer than it should have been, and at that point I was having 2016 flashbacks in a big way. And then Indiana always comes in early because the polls close early there, and Joe Donnelly was getting destroyed. And then Amy McGrath in Kentucky, because Kentucky always closes early. And I remember I had some friends who did some work for Amy McGrath, and they had told me that, you know, she was up 8 at one point in a private poll, and then after Kavanaugh and the caravan, she was down to up 2. And so I already had that fear. So those 3 races at the beginning of the night, I mean, you were in the office. We were all doing a live stream, and we also had been doing a live stream in 2016 when we were at the Ringer. And I was just having all these flashbacks, and like, and Lovett and Tommy and I and Dan were at one point just all in our office huddled there, and everyone's like, the live stream's happening, there's people watching, and we're like, we're not going into that fucking live stream. This is going bad right now. I don't know. And we're all freaking out. And then I think it was when Abigail Spanberger looked like she was going to win, and some of the other Virginia races came in, the New Jersey races came in, that it started feeling like, oh, this is going to be okay. And then by the end of the night, when it was exactly what you said. Like when I saw Stacey Abrams' speech, I was like all inspired by that. I started looking at the map. I thought, okay, we've got 26 called. It looks like, they were saying at that point, it looks like it could get up to 35. No one was saying 40 at that point. But I thought, you know, if we get to 30, 35 seats here, and, you know, we only lose a couple Senate seats and we've won 7 governorships, this is a really great night. So I felt pretty good by the time I went to bed, and then like a week later, then I felt great. And it was awesome.
So you just mentioned that no one was talking about 40 seats and possibly 35 being flipped. All of these seats were in, well, not all of them, a lot of them were in red districts or blue districts that were more moderate. How do you think so many Democrats were able to win in these districts, but Democrats that we often hear are not electable because they won't appeal to enough people, and, you know, a district with white voters might not support this person of color. I guess I kind of threw in an answer a little bit, but how do you think they were able to appeal to a wide swath of voters and actually be successful on election night?
Okay. So I'll step back just a little. Like I think one of the bigger trends that we saw happen in 2018 is the election was more nationalized than it has ever been, right? So it used to be that if you're an incumbent senator in a red state or a blue state and you have a challenge, the incumbency sort of helps you hang on, right? We saw that sort of advantage fade away. And so basically, and someone said this, I forget who it was, this election ended up being less about sort of like persuading voters, and it was more like a census. It was just like you showed up in a state, and it was a lot more about demographics. And so I think like 88% of Trump approvers voted for the Republican candidate, which is a new record. And then 90% of people who disapproved of Trump voted Democrat, which is also a new record. You usually have more switchers than that. And then it became an electorate that was more polarized than ever before. So 60% of white voters with college degrees or more, and 70% of all non-white voters disapproved of Trump. Wow. And so if it was a district or a state where there was a more diverse state, if it was more college-educated white voters, then it was likely, whether it was a district or a state, it was likely to go Democrat, no matter who the candidate was. And if it was a state that was sparsely populated, non-college educated white voters, and not many non-white voters, then it was likely to remain in Republican hands. And that was true across the country. Now, of course, there are some states that are on the margin, right? And demographics can get you like 90% of the way there in terms of predicting the outcome. But then candidate quality matters, message matters, organizing matters, turnout obviously matters, and we can talk about all those things too. But I think what we saw in this election, at least demographically, is like Democrats ended up winning a lot of big cities, suburbs around big cities, and it used to be big cities and suburbs and big cities in blue states. And what happened in 2018, which was interesting, is we started seeing Democrats win in districts where there were big cities and medium-sized cities and suburbs around these cities in red states. So cities like Houston and Phoenix and Richmond, Virginia, which usually vote Republican, started acting more like cities like Miami and DC and New York, and they acted more like those cities than they did the states that they were in, the red states that they were in.
Gotcha.
I think also something to think on is, after the 2016 election, I think the idea of, everything that is like left and right kind of got pushed more towards like the right. So therefore, a lot of policies that we might think of like as the left or, more Democrat policies or something that might be more open to more conservative or more traditionally Republican areas. And so I think just like the energy of just feeling like something going on in this country isn't right. And people feeling like they want to change that and they want to move away from whatever the current is. And so midterms usually act as like a referendum against the president anyways. Mm-hmm. And I think just with so much that was happening, especially like around the time which you mentioned, like, there was the bomb threats, there was just so much happening in the country that I think people really just wanted something different. And so whether it was, a Democrat or just like not the same candidate that they had before, I think people just wanted a change.
Yeah. And looking specifically at California, something I've always wondered is why, I can't remember who said this to me, but they said California was second for sending the most Republicans to Congress. Now, granted, California has a ton of districts, but California is also always talked about as a blue state that we can reliably get Democrats. We don't need to worry about that. Like, California's good. So I guess I'm trying to see if you all have any thoughts on why that narrative was able to continue for so long, but why in 2018 someone finally, or a bunch of people probably said this, but that there was like this decision to say, no, there are a lot of red districts here, and there are some that we can actually flip, and we're going to try to do that.
I think there are two things that happened. The first is, I think it was in 2012, back, and this was a result of what happened when Schwarzenegger was governor. They did nonpartisan redistricting in this state. Oh, yeah. And by drawing lines that were nonpartisan, they, at that point, they sort of took down the number of Republican seats. But the Republican seats that were left over still, they sent these Republicans to Congress regularly for the next couple elections. What happened was Trump. And so in 2016, you had a bunch of counties around Orange County districts. You had a couple, you had the 25th district and the 39th district north of LA, and then you had a couple districts sort of south of San Francisco. And they voted for a Republican candidate, but they didn't vote for Trump. They voted for Hillary Clinton. And so, and of course, we saw that at Crooked Media, and we had our Crooked 7, because we thought, okay, these are 7 districts that voted for Hillary Clinton for president, but they still have a Republican. And the problem for those Republicans in those seats were they didn't decide to be moderate Republicans. They didn't look around at their district and say, oh, okay, this district voted for Hillary Clinton. Like, maybe we have a problem here. Like, Mimi Walters, who Katie Porter beat, she voted with Trump like 90-something% of the time. She voted for the tax cut. She voted to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. She supported him on all of his crazy immigration shit. And so, like, these people were very out of step with districts that had become, they were heavily populated by college-educated white voters, and they're districts that have become much more diverse over the. So they were hanging on for a while, but at some point the wave just sort of swept them away.
I also think, just speaking on that, gentrification is like changing like sort of the landscape of California right now. But as much as these places flipped, there is still like a heavy sense of like Trumpness to places like Orange County, or like, if you try to go to the Bay Area, you will see like the giant signs that say like pro-Trump, and that element is still there. But I do think that like other propositions like Prop 10 also help more people get out to vote. And so there were other, incentives out there other than just like necessarily voting for representative that made people come out and switch.
Yeah. And I kind of touched on this before, but what lessons do you think we've learned from people who are not white guys winning elections? I think there's often this conversation about who's electable and who people can relate to, but we saw a lot of candidates put their message out. It didn't matter what they looked like or what they identified as. It resonated with people, and they were able to be elected. So, one, what do you think we learned from that? But with having such a diverse group of Democrats now in positions of power to make laws, what do you think the impact will be on our actual policy creation as we have those new people in place?
I think that's yet to be seen. I think for what we've seen when we've had diverse candidates, that you can't necessarily hope that just because a candidate looks like you, that they're going to represent you. And so hopefully that means that, this new freshman class will actually like represent the communities I've wanted to, see representation in DC. And I think that also, that means holding them accountable, right, keeping up with like what they're actually voting on. We saw before candidates running on like abolish ICE, but then like vote, to fund ICE. And so I think, having a diverse representatives is important, but I don't think we should necessarily like see that as equaling that we're gonna have actually policies that benefit people that need to be represented more in DC.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about electability, right? Like, my view on electability now is after 2 presidential elections where a black guy from the south side of Chicago named Barack Hussein Obama won, and then Donald fucking Trump won. No one should ever be judging electability again in this country. Certainly no one in politics. And I think that happened in 2018 with the recruitment of candidates. And when I was doing the Wilderness, and I was talking to a lot of people who recruit candidates and run a lot of these organizations. And one of the problems is when folks in Washington start recruiting candidates, they end up recruiting the candidates who they think are electable and who they think can raise money. And those people tend to be white, and they tend to be male, and their profession tends to be lawyer. And I think what we saw in 2018 was, first of all, credit to the DCCC, they did a really great job recruiting a lot of good candidates, but a lot of candidates also came from non-traditional places. And, we saw groups like Run for Something spread up that recruited a whole bunch of candidates from diverse backgrounds and diverse professions and have different viewpoints and stuff like that. And I do think that one, like Trump may have helped with Democratic recruitment, and particularly recruiting candidates that don't always look like typical Democratic candidates. And I think what we saw is the idea that, only some moderate white guy is electable in a lot of these districts was proven wrong by most of the candidates that we fielded this time.
Okay, so we're gonna wrap up on the House now and shift over to the Senate. Republicans did a lot better in the Senate, and part of that is they had a better map. But when you look at places like North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri, where Democrats lost those seats, is there some type of change happening in the Midwest that we have maybe missed, or were those Democrats lucky in being elected under kind of Barack Obama being president, or either being on the ticket or president at the time, or some might even say Claire McCaskill got lucky in her last election with her opponent. But are we missing something there? Especially also, if you want to add in on this, thinking about the South. And so, again, Stacey Abrams didn't win, Beto O'Rourke didn't win, and neither did Andrew Gilliam, but they all got a lot closer than people like Phil Bredesen. So could you talk about some of those dynamics? Maybe it's the type of candidates, maybe there's some kind of geographical shift going on. But yeah, what was behind the Senate being the way it was?
So I feel when it came to the Senate candidate, especially when you mentioned Claire McCaskill, she wasn't an exciting candidate, and I would say as like a moderate Democrat, I think that like in states where you're trying to flip and where we saw, that kind of happen, you need to have someone who's going to sort of challenge more and bring some sort of like energy to make people actually want to come out and vote. And I think with one of the races, like in Mississippi with Mike Epsby, that one I don't think people were necessarily paying attention to until like, it became time for like a recount. And then we saw who the person who was like currently being senator, which was Cindy Hyde-Smith, who, yeah, and who's now currently senator. And so I feel like, something to pay attention to when it just comes to like the Midwest and the South is that I think, we shouldn't underestimate places and thinking that, talking about electability, that someone like a Mike Epsby wouldn't be able to bring out like the votes. But definitely making it so that, we're doing something to make it where people actually want to come out and vote, and something where it's going to energize the base. And I just don't know if in the Midwest those candidates did that.
I think that's exactly right. And I think candidate quality in states like that have been slipping away from us is hugely important. And, one of my favorite things that a whole bunch of DC pundits and reporters got wrong is they would always say, like, what are all these Democrats giving their money to Beto O'Rourke for, and getting all excited about Beto O'Rourke when Phil Bredesen has a much better chance of winning Tennessee because he's a serious, moderate conservative in a conservative state, and Beto O'Rourke's some liberal running around in Texas. And like Phil Bredesen didn't even come within a fucking country mile of winning that state, and Beto O'Rourke did better than any Democrat in like decades, right? But I do think, it depends on the state, right? I think the 3 states where we lost, I'll put Florida aside for a second, but the 3 states where we lost by a larger margin, Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota, like Claire McCaskill, Joe Donnelly, and Heidi Heitkamp outperformed. They had a larger vote margin, they had a higher vote percentage than Barack Obama did in those states, than Hillary Clinton did in those states. And the only candidates that had gotten a higher vote percentage in those states in the last couple decades was the 3 of them in their earlier races. And all 3 of them had much weaker opponents back in 2012 or whenever they ran last. They had Claire McCaskill ran against Todd Akin, who was like a complete disaster, right? So she had a tougher opponent this time. Claire McCaskill got, the same percentage of the vote as Jason Kander did, who, I think ran a very close race last time around. So there is a ceiling for Democrats in some of these states, and it has to do with what I was saying earlier, which is just non-college educated white voters who used to make up, I think they made up like a quarter of Barack Obama's coalition in 2008, and they are just slipping away from Democrats. Now, as they're slipping away from Democrats, college-educated white voters are slipping away from Republicans, right? Like Barack Obama, all the candidates this time did far better with college-educated white voters than Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton did. So there's sort of this like equal and opposite reaction here that's getting polarized. But in states where there just aren't enough non-white voters and college-educated white voters, like Missouri, like Indiana, like North Dakota, I think Democrats are going to, even with exciting candidates, Democrats are going to have a very hard time. But their only hope is to nominate really inspiring candidates to try to juice turnout as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And one last question around these Senate wins and losses. Why weren't Republicans able to, and maybe this was all Trump, but in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan where Trump won and everyone was surprised by it, what happened there for those? And even Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin didn't really have a problem winning her reelection. What happened with Republicans in those states?
Yeah, I mean, so this was the big exception to sort of the non-college educated whites slipping away from the Democratic Party is in the upper Midwest states and some of these northeastern states like Pennsylvania. And part of it is I think there is sort of more of a Democratic tradition. There's more of a union tradition in these states. So Democrats like Tammy Baldwin, Sherrod Brown, and Debbie Stabenow, and then the governors, we elected 3 governors in those states. Yeah. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, and then in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin as well. And so you saw both, like Hillary in 2016 suffered from a little lower African American turnout in those states, mm-hmm. and then was crushed among non-college educated white voters. In 2018, the candidates saw higher African American turnout, and a lot of those non-college educated white voters, those Obama-Trump voters, came home to the Democratic Party in those states. Mm-hmm. But those states did act differently than southern states and then some of the Midwestern states out more to the west.
I think you're also just seeing like people that voted for Trump in 2016, like his approval ratings are just dropping in general and he's losing his base. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's just like an overall sort of, losing interest and favorability around those who voted for him in 2016.
Yeah. Okay, now we're going to do another shift into state elections. Do you two feel like you are following state elections? We can take out the governor's races, but do you feel like you were following like state legislature races really closely?
We're paying attention to, attorney general. There was like 7 black attorney generals that were running. And we're paying attention to like the Secretary of State races. And I feel like overall those races, state races don't necessarily get the same shine as national races, but they do hold a lot of power when it comes to, like we saw that, and bring it back to Georgia, we saw how important like the Attorney General was in that election when it came to voter suppression, just protecting voter rights. So we really try to, reporting, like, focus and highlight on educating our readership on just, who was running, why these rules are important, why people should pay attention, and then just, like, with ballot initiatives as well, just, what actual propositions were on their ballot. And I think state elections are actually a way to get people to turn out to vote who may be kind of turned off by what's happening in D.C., and I think like state elections can be a way to kind of bring them back in by focusing on like local more elections that can directly have an effect on their daily life more immediately.
Yeah, I mean, I am now. I was in 2018, but I'll be honest, as long as I've been in politics, I didn't focus as much, like you said, on the gubernatorial level, you would once in a while, but it's part of the Democratic Party's problem for most of the Obama administration is that we didn't focus enough on state legislative races and AG races, Secretary of State races. And I think one reason it's so important to focus on them now and to get people excited about them is, we elected this really exciting, diverse Democratic House, and unfortunately, they're not going to be able to get much done until we get Trump out of the White House. So when you want to go to voters and say, you want to vote for someone because they actually do something for you, because they change your life in some way, because they pass a policy, where can that happen? That can happen on the state level. And my favorite example of this is the elections in Virginia in 2017. And because there was this sort of like surge in turnout and organizing, and we came very close to flipping the Virginia legislature, and Democrats picked up quite a few seats because they did, and because Ralph Northam was elected governor. Virginia expanded Medicaid, and now there's 200,000 people who will have health insurance in Virginia who didn't before. And if you can go to voters and say, yeah, if you care about the state legislative race, if you care about this attorney general race, if you care about the secretary of state race, it's actually going to mean something to your life. It's going to change your life in a meaningful way. That's how you're going to get people to participate in the process again.
So why do you think people are not paying attention? Do they not know? Do you think the media should be playing a larger role in getting people interested and not only focusing on national politics?
Yeah, I think the media definitely has like an important role in that, because when it comes to elections, people are consuming what they're given. And so if you're getting most of your information from cable news, state races aren't as glamorous. And so I think that it's up to us in media, to definitely make sure that we're highlighting races that aren't just national and that aren't just like flashy.
Yeah, I mean, it's, unfortunately, we live in a celebrity media culture that focuses on individuals, and, we can barely see anything but Trump.
Right.
And, one of the things that I think we all have to focus on is as we look forward to 2020, we're going to have like 20-something Democrats running for president. We're going to have Donald Trump out there. But, we still need to make sure we elect a Democratic House. Flipping the Senate is incredibly important. And then there's going to be another batch of governorships and state legislatures that, as you pointed out in the presentation, that we can potentially flip. And that's going to matter in a huge way to redistricting in 2021. I mean, that can set the boundaries for Congress for a generation.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of go back in history a little. As we talk about state legislatures, not everyone was ignoring down ballot races. After the 2010 elections, where Republicans were able to kind of sweep in at every level, they never stopped paying attention to those races. So what did Democrats miss? Like, did they miss the memo? What happened there? And do you think they're going to start paying attention to that now? Well, I think we know that answer.
No, I mean, one thing Republicans have is they have billionaires like the Koch brothers who can go in, and it doesn't cost as much money to, invest in a state legislature race, in a secretary of state race, and they flipped a whole bunch of seats by just pouring a whole bunch of money in there. And we don't necessarily have that on the Democratic side. So that's number one. Number two, I do think that just Democrats have. This happened under Bill Clinton. It happened under Barack Obama. We, for too long, just focused too much on the presidency, right, and to a lesser extent, Congress. And so we and also when you have it is true that when you have a president of the same party, in the White House, sort of the whole party infrastructure revolves around making sure that you reelect that president, and that's true for both parties. And for Democrats, that meant that the DNC and everything else was sort of focused around Obama and reelecting Obama in 2012. And by the way, because, we needed a lot of money to beat Mitt Romney in 2012 because he was outspending us. So a lot of the money goes up to the presidential level, and there's not as much focus on the states. And like you said, I think that's rectified now.
With the last midterms, I think you saw, DSA, for example, really focusing on energizing more on like local elections on the state level. And so I think when you see sort of the Democrats go to like a return to grassroots organizing and really focusing on not just the presidential election, but kind of reconnecting with their base, and especially progressives, I think you might see in the 2020 election more of an effort to get some of these seats in the state level.
So kind of at another layer on top of the state elections, ballot initiatives, we saw a ton, as I mentioned during the presentation. We had 3 states pass Medicaid expansion, but these weren't states that you would expect to, because if we expected them to, their legislatures would have done it already. But voters took it upon themselves to do it. Minimum wage was increased in a couple states. Does it tell us something about the voters? Because, again, in some of these states, we also saw conservative ballot measures get through. What does that tell us about the voters as far as, maybe the level of attention they're paying to the things they're not getting that maybe other states are getting, or what it says about their desire to be involved and kind of what their state looks like in regards to the policies that are in place that they get to directly
I think people are tired with how slow our, legislative system is. And so I know people who weren't really excited to go vote for a candidate, but was really hoping that Proposition 10 passed. So that made them want to come out. And so, when we look at things like medical marijuana or the passage of Amendment 4, it is a way for people to be able to sort of practice direct democracy in a sense. And I do think people like feeling like they have more control over their life and they have more control over decisions, and that, they're actually doing something that is making a direct change. And so I think that's kind of where the drive and, for ballot initiatives are kind of growing.
I'm really fascinated by particularly the minimum wage ballot measures and the Medicaid expansion ballot measures that pass in very deep red states, because our Democratic candidates who were proposing those policies do not win there. And Republican candidates propose the opposite of those policies. And I think it tells you a few things that, Republicans, and of course they have an entire media infrastructure behind them to help, and now a sort of a media goon in our president to help too, are very successful at demonizing and otherizing Democratic candidates. And they use racial resentment, they use nativist resentment, and they fight to make these elections, when there are candidates on the ballot, about sort of this culture war, right? That's what Trump did with the caravan. That's what he did in that last month. But if left to their own devices, and you ask these, a lot of these, like I said, non-college educated white voters barely getting by, if you ask them, do you want a higher minimum wage? Do you want health care for your family? Do you want sort of the government to step in and give you and provide sort of the tools and the resources to support your family? They'll say yes. But somehow when a Democratic candidate is attached to it, they won't. And so it sort of shows how polarized, how successfully polarized the country is under Donald Trump, how he's been successful at polarizing the country. I don't know if Democratic candidates can sort of overcome some of those racial resentments and nativist resentments in those states, at least in states like Arkansas, probably not. But it does tell you something about states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, that went to Trump, that sort of came back to the Democrats in 2018. It does tell you something about, and look, a lot of these candidates in 2018, a lot of these Democratic candidates, we haven't talked about this yet, but they all ran on healthcare. They had incredible message discipline. That if you really sort of hit these economic issues in some of these states, you get some of these voters back. Not all of them, because some of them are lost for good. But you get some of them back, maybe just enough to reassemble the coalition that you need.
Do you think it's short-sighted in any way or risky? And I guess this could be on both sides. Republicans put conservative ballot measures, like in North Carolina, to drive turnout, probably to try to protect themselves from some of the resentment against the party in that state. But do you think it's risky to go the route of ballot initiatives, especially thinking about what you just said? It's a better alternative to the candidate, because ultimately you do get whatever policy you voted for in a ballot initiative, but you don't get an elected official who's going to then act on, one, the implementation of whatever that is, but also all the other policies you want to see, because you don't have an endless list of ballot measures to create a perfect world for yourself.
I think it's loading the deck. I don't think it should be the strategy to only, try to go through ballot initiatives, But I do think that, and sometimes where you'll have favorable ballot initiatives that are progressive that will pass, but you won't have progressive candidates actually win.
Yeah, it's sort of a sign that the state government in that state is broken in some way, or is at least too gridlocked to pass something, right? So it's a decent substitute in a lot of places, but it's no substitute for representatives in the state house that are more responsive to the will of the people.
Yeah.
That would be much better.
So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience so you all can ask your questions. So you can be thinking about those. As I mentioned during the presentation, turnout was a lot higher than it has been in other midterms. Well, I mean, even we directly tried to participate in that with Vote Save America. But what are some of the reasons, be it Trump or what are some of those dynamics that got more people to the polls and interested in this midterm in a way that they hadn't been in the past?
I mean, yeah, I think definitely it was Trump. You can't kind of avoid that. But I also just think that there was a lot of exciting candidates, and that even if they weren't going to be your representative, they still made you interested in paying attention to the midterms. And I think the media, really definitely took more of a proactive role in covering the midterms. It felt like 2016, it felt like a presidential election, even though it was just midterms. And I just think that's overall because of Trump. He's kind of made politics, for better or worse, something that people more care about now. And I think, people just really were hoping that, okay, if we, switch and the Dems get the House, then maybe he can get impeached, or just some kind of hope that voting in 2018 would make 2020 come closer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump triggered sort of an equal and opposite reaction on the other side. And, we've been talking about this since we started Crooked Media, but, Trump sort of represents this national emergency. Mm-hmm. And the country responded like it was a national emergency. I mean, you showed up there in your slide, the idea that in a whole bunch of counties, turnout equaled 2016 turnout. In some places, it surpassed 2016 turnout, which is unheard of. I mean, it was like I said, it's the largest turnout. It was the best turnout since 1914 in a midterm election. I think Trump did that. I think you're right that the media did that. I also think it was just a ton of organizing on the ground, and organizing from the party apparatus, but also the indivisibles, the swing lefts, all these different groups that came together that sprouted up around the end. Like Candice said, people came out to vote for something on the Democratic side, right? They were scared of Trump. He probably piqued their interest in politics, got them nervous. They were, a lot of people would have walked over coals to go vote, to just vote against Donald Trump. But in addition to that, and this matters on the margins in a lot of close races, there were a lot of candidates who were inspiring, who told, people that I want to go out and vote for that candidate.
So we just kind of talked about a lot of the dynamics behind a lot of the headlines. Are there any things that were not in the headlines that you thought should have been covered or weren't covered enough?
I would say post midterms, I think that we kind of dropped the ball on covering the voter suppression that was so obviously happening. It was after the week of midterms, it's kind of just no follow up, and it's where is the accountability for the Republican Party or for some of these candidates that might have, helped to aid voter suppression in some of these states that we saw where there were just very clear examples of it. So I think moving forward and looking at 2020, that we can't just wait until it happens and it's too late. Really just keeping an eye on, when voter suppression is happening, but also just paying attention to redistricting and, just following these elections and post-election results longer than just the immediate aftermath of election night.
There was some coverage before the election about the youth vote. Will young people turn out? it turns out that not only did young people turn out, and young people turn out in a greater percentage than they had in the past, but the margins, the Democratic margins among now not just 18 to 29-year-olds, but 30 to 44-year-olds are just, they're unheard of. We've never seen anything like that before. So now the Republican Party has 2 generations that they've lost. They have millennials and they have Gen Z. And as we go into 2020, number one, young people turn out in greater numbers in a presidential election than they do in a midterm. So Republicans are going to have to contend with that. There'll be a larger share of the electorate in 2020 than they were before, because that happens in presidential elections. And also, young people will represent a greater share of the electorate than baby boomers for the first time in 2020. And look, even among older voters in 2018, Republicans only broke even, which was something of a surprise as well. And so if they're going to break even among older voters, they win the boomers, because the boomers. And then Democrats are winning crushing margins among everyone from 18 to 44. That's a huge problem for the Republican Party.
Final question, 2020. Any thoughts? Just whatever you're thinking about.
Oh, no. I mean, look, I think the Democrats should feel, no one should feel confident about anything, but they should feel somewhat optimistic that, look, the good news is sort of the map is set from 2018. Sort of the backdrop of the 2020 election is set because of what happened in 2018. And you have to think to yourself, if people were going to turn out in those margins to vote against Trump in the midterm, then in a presidential election, it's going to be hard to, and it's also going to be hard to change the dynamic. Usually, when a president does poorly in a midterm, that president moderates in some way, they change something in some way. Part of what happened after, because election night wasn't this like decisive win, and we didn't know it was a decisive win until a week after, is all the Republicans just pretended that like nothing went wrong, and Donald Trump pretended that nothing went wrong, and there's going to be zero course correction between now and then. And the other good thing is he lost 40 seats with 4% unemployment, and that has never happened before, right? And the economy's probably at its high point as it was in the election, right? So it'll either be the same or worse probably by 2020, and so it's going to be hard for that. Now, on the tough side of the ledger, I do think the one thing that 2018 showed us is Trump's voters show up. And one of the reasons the turnout was the highest it's ever been is not just because of Democratic turnout, but Republican turnout. And the idea that, some of these Republican voters and Trump voters are going to feel dispirited, they're going to stay home. They did not stay home. They came out. And so in a presidential election, you're going to see higher youth turnout and higher African American and Latino turnout, but you'll probably also see a higher turnout of non-college whites, because non-college educated white voters tend to not vote as much in midterm elections too. So again, you're going to have both bases probably turn out in 2020, and the question's going to be, who can turn out more of their base and who can sort of grab some of those independent Obama-Trump voters and bring them to their side.
I also think it's very important, if 2016 isn't any lesson for the Democrats, is that you cannot just run on "we're not Trump." Like, you have to give people something to want to vote for. And I think depending how these next 2 years are with the new freshman class and how much people really deliver on, Medicare for all and some of these progressive policies that really energize people to want to go out and vote, is going to decide whether or not people actually really do continue to show out in 2020. And so I think not resting on the fact that, Trump is bad enough candidate to get someone elected, making sure whoever the DNC candidate is for president, it's someone that, really represents the progressive base that has felt like ignored in the 2016 election. And making sure that lessons from 2016 are something that we're learning and not something that is lost.
Thank you. Can you give our guests another round of applause? So now the ushers, if you just raise your hand, the ushers will come around with microphones and you all can ask your questions.
Hi there. So since Trump was elected, we've seen obviously way higher levels of activism than we have in the past. We had millions of people over here. Hi, millions of people turn out to the Women's March, for instance. Largest protest in American history. We've seen lots of people canvassing, making phone calls for the midterms, and I'm sure that'll continue into 2020. My question is though, after Trump is gone. Do you think that'll continue? Do you think we have a new dynamic now, where people have become activists, they become more engaged with politics, or do you think once Trump is no longer president, things will sort of return to normal?
I mean, I think we hadn't engaged sort of like, people protesting and active pre-Trump, but I do think that we're seeing, like before Trump was elected, we had the Black Lives Matter movement, we had Occupy during Obama, and so I think now with Trump, we're seeing sort of like people who might have not cared about what was happening and under the previous administration sort of feel more active. And I think if Democrats take, the president's office in 2020, you're still going to have people who, if issues like income inequality, racial inequality, aren't addressed in a real way, you're still going to have political unrest. I think that's going to continue. What you might see is it being less white people actually showing up to some of these protests. But as long as there's still poor people and black people being shot by cops, I think you're still going to see that sort of political unrest continue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I certainly, I hope it's that the activism continues, and I think it's incumbent upon everyone who cares about this country and who has been part of these marches to make sure that the activism continues. As I look back on the Obama administration, one thing I think about is in 2008, all these young people came out to vote and to organize for the very first time, but there was still sort of this transactional view of politics where it's, okay, Barack Obama is this really great, inspiring candidate. I'm going to hand him my vote. He's going to go to Washington, fix everything in the country. I can go back to my life. Everything's cool. And that's obviously not what happened, right? And democracy is an everyday struggle. And I think, and I hope what Trump has taught us is that long after Trump has gone, there will be frustrations, there will be crises, there will be things that go wrong in government all the time. It's always going to be like that. It is never going to be fixed. But our job is to constantly try to fix it. And, so I hope that's something that all of us take away from that. But that's going to be on us. It's going to be on us to persuade people to do that. And I do hope that, young people who are coming of age for the first time in the Trump presidency, I think, habits form when you're young, and that if democracy and activism is a habit that you grow up with, that you see that your parents teach you, then it hopefully is something that continues on to adulthood. So I do have hope for the generation that is becoming really active.
Yeah, hi, thanks for your message that you've given us tonight. Good. I've heard it said on a number of occasions that Trump didn't win, Hillary lost. And when you ask them, what does that mean? Oftentimes they say, Hillary neglected the 55-year-old blue-collar, out-of-work white man who had been a staple of the Democratic Party since Franklin Roosevelt. Would you care to comment on that? Oh, and a footnote, that if the Democrats continue to ignore that segment of the population, they'll be at risk. So, do you have anything you'd like to say about that?
Want me to take that one? Cool. So I think when you dig into 2016, which we will be relitigating right up until 2020. So there's a lot of factors, right, that come into play. Obviously, we've never had an election where a hostile foreign power interfered in the election on behalf of one candidate. That happened. And Was it effective? Was the social media campaign by the Russians effective? Was the hack of Hillary's and the DNC's emails effective? You know, we can never know for sure, but you think to yourself, okay, publish your inbox tomorrow while you're running a race and see how that goes, you know? So there's that. And it was, and as we're learning, it was targeted. It was targeted towards some of those Midwestern states where there is a preponderance of non-college educated white voters, older voters. So there's that problem. There's also the fact that Hillary, as the first female major party nominee, faced sexism. Undoubtedly true. And so she had to grapple with that. And so there was that she had to deal with. Now, there's also the fact that she was running against Donald Trump, who activated racial resentment in this country. It's not like he invented it. It was out there, but you know, it was maybe dormant in some voters, and he activated. He threw the gas on that fire more than any Republican candidate had ever done. You know, they all engaged in dog whistles for a long time, but Donald Trump brought the bullhorn, right? I mean, Donald Trump was a George Wallace running for president, and so, you know, that helped as well. So those are all the things that Hillary faced. Now, I think that, you know, would another candidate, a generic Democratic candidate, have beat Trump? Perhaps. What Hillary also had was 10, 20, 30 years of baggage, right? Some her fault, some not her fault. A lot not her fault, right? But for better or for worse, the Clintons had been attacked, had been under the microscope for decades. Then she runs a campaign where some of the attacks from the left, from Bernie Sanders, were then echoed by some of the attacks from the right. And so she had to deal with that. And so she was portrayed as someone who was distant, out of touch, and not paying attention to the economic concerns of everyday people. Maybe the Wall Street speeches played into that. Maybe some of the Clinton Foundation stuff played into that, right? Again, was it fair? Other people can judge that. A lot of it I don't think was fair. But the caricature that they painted of Hillary, Trump, the Russians, the Republicans, was someone who was very out of touch from the concerns of everyday working people. Well, okay. So everyone talks about Wisconsin. Right. She did not go to Wisconsin. You know where she did go? Pennsylvania. A lot. You know where she ran a ton of ads? Pennsylvania. A lot. She spent a ton of money in Pennsylvania, and she lost Pennsylvania. So you're right. Should she have gone to Wisconsin? Yeah, she should have gone to Wisconsin. But when she tried that in Pennsylvania, it still didn't work. So then you have to ask yourself, was it about her travel schedule? Not really when it came to Pennsylvania. And so I do think there was this caricature of Hillary, whether, you know, some of it real, most of it imagined, that she was out of touch with. Now, did she have a very progressive economic policy? She did. In a lot of places, it was more progressive than Barack Obama's policies, and when he won twice. But that message never got out there. You're right. Like, it never got out to people that Hillary was concerned about working class problems. And that's an issue, right? Is it her fault? Is it not her fault? At this point, it doesn't matter. What we have to make sure of is that the next Democratic nominee in 2020 has to have an economic message that gets through, that punches through, that connects with people. And part of that is, look, Donald Trump would go out there and say something racist, sexist, unbelievably offensive. And what did the Clintons do? The Clinton campaign says, okay, we got to hit back. Now, sometimes you do have to hit back because you can't let Donald Trump run around saying racist shit and not respond. But the problem is, by doing that, he sucks you into his media ecosystem. And so it's all about Trump and his racism and his nativism and his sexism. And then the other story is about how the Democratic candidate responds to his bullshit. And we need to have a Democratic candidate and a Democratic strategy that operates in a media ecosystem that is apart from Donald Trump, that doesn't always necessarily respond to Donald Trump. And I'll tell you what was a good example of this is, you know, the other night, you know, Donald Trump, like a week after Elizabeth Warren announces for president, starts making fun of her. He does the Pocahontas thing. He makes fun of her for drinking a beer with her husband. He does all these tweets. And you know what was great about it? Elizabeth Warren completely ignored it. She did not respond to it. I didn't see a lot of Democrats online respond to it. The media didn't take the bait. Everyone ignored Donald Trump for once, and it worked, you know? And so, and you see Elizabeth Warren had dealt with this early because she put out this video to respond to the Native American thing, and I don't think that went very well for her. So fast forward to her rollout, and she doesn't talk about Donald Trump at all. She talks about her economic message. She has a fantastic rollout, and so I do think there's lessons to be learned from what the Clinton campaign went through in 2016. And I think one of those lessons is we have to have an economic message that punches through.
Okay, next
Hi.
question.
Okay, so John, I'd like to take it back a second and disagree with you on something. According to findings by the Pew Research Center, the millennial generation actually had the highest number of voters in United States history, greater than the baby boomers in 2016.
Oh, in 2016?
In 2016, yes. I wrote my thesis about this. However, they didn't show up to vote.
Right.
You're absolutely right. They showed up
Right.
50%. It was a terrible disaster. However, they did show up to vote in 2018, and I want to know why you think that is and how we continue that momentum and keep young people engaged.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit what we've been saying tonight, right? Is some of it was, politics is something that happened somewhere else. I'm not interested. Barack Obama was a cool guy who was president for 2 terms. I like him. I still feel like I'm facing crushing debt. He didn't fix that. Politics didn't fix that. And so in 2016, I see Hillary Clinton up there. She doesn't seem to be speaking to me either. I don't know. Maybe I like her too, but I don't know if she can fix it either. Does it really matter? There's a lot of that, right? So then Donald Trump wins and everyone's like, oh shit, okay. So this is bad. So part of it is Donald Trump sort of awakens this generation. And part of it is they had, like we said, candidates who inspired them, who they went out to vote for. And, David Plouffe, who ran both of Obama's campaigns, always says, you need to have a candidate who you are willing to sort of stay up all night, knock on doors, make phone calls till you're bone tired, you need to be so excited about this candidate that you are willing to do anything for this person if you're working on the campaign, if you're an organizer. And that requires a really exciting candidate. And that's why, people, oh, you guys paid so much attention to all these candidates that lost, like Beto and Stacey Abrams, Andrew Gilliam, because those 3 candidates, white guy, African-American woman, African-American male, those 3 candidates excited a whole generation of people. So many people were excited by those candidates, and that matters. That inspiration and excitement that they got those volunteers to knock on doors and to do grassroots fundraising, all this kind of stuff, that hugely matters, especially in a close election. And so I do think when we think about who we're going to nominate in 2020, and Candice was saying this, it has to be someone who inspires that cohort of people. And I think that's more important than what the resume is, what they've done, what the record, all this kind of stuff. They need to be qualified. They need to know their shit. They need to have their message down. But that quality, that sort of intangible quality of excitement and inspiration, that has to be there.
And just to add, I think also, Democrats went back to something they did in 2008 with Obama's election, was just grassroots organizing. I think that was just that's something that more connects to younger generations, and I think that's something that definitely brought more people out.
Hi, John. I wanted to touch on Pod Save America and this new digital space we're seeing, which is public radio and its effects on the midterm elections and its role in the 2020 elections. And public radio is a little bit less universal than cable news and traditional news websites. So how does platforms like Pod Save America and all the other shows on Crooked Media reach non-democratic voters?
Yeah, that's something that we're working on all the time. No, it's tough because, you grow a podcast audience to a certain point, and then you still realize that it's a small percentage of people who are even listening to podcasts, right? And so you need to reach beyond that. I think, as we look ahead to where we're going to go next and what our content strategy is, we're constantly looking at other platforms, whether it's radio, whether it's television. I mean, we had that, HBO special. We're trying to do more in video. And so we are constantly trying to figure out sort of where, whether it's working with Snapchat or Instagram, we're trying to meet voters where they are, right? And especially to go to new places. Part of this is too, we're going on tour again, and we try to make sure we go to red states. So, our first first swing is we're going to New Orleans, and we're going to Louisiana, we're going to Charleston, South Carolina, we're going to Durham, North Carolina, we're going to go to Salt Lake City this year. So we are trying to go to places that are in redder states so we can expand the audience. But look, I do think whether it's us, whether it's other progressive media in general, it is key to sort of reach beyond just people who live in cities to other voters. That said, the Democratic, as we were talking about tonight, the Democratic coalition is clustered in cities and suburbs, whether they're in blue states or red states. And so that is the audience that we're trying to reach and energize. And sort of the swing voters are the ones sort of on the outskirts of the suburbs, sort of the exurbs. So you got to try to figure out a way to get to them as well. And to get to young people too, because we haven't talked about this a lot, but one of the most important cohorts to reach is non-voters, right? People who think like us, who have our values, who believe what we believe, but maybe don't think that politics is for them, or that politics can make a difference in their lives. And I think that's the most important thing to do, because when you're talking about that 55-year-old voter who is a Trump voter now and maybe used to vote Democrat, but voted for Trump, still didn't vote for Democrat in 2018, you're probably going to have a much harder time reaching that voter than to grab a young voter and say, politics actually can make a difference in your life. Please register to vote, and we'll show you that it matters.
So we're just going to take 2 more questions from whoever the 2 people who have the mics are now. But Candice, did you want to talk some about the work that Blavity is doing just to get folks engaged in Blavity politics?
Yeah. So with Blavity Politics, we're focusing on, providing news and information to an audience of mostly, millennials, just highlighting people of color and Black politicians. We're focusing on issues, everything from tech policy to criminal justice to immigration. Of course, 2020 and presidential election. We have an Instagram page, because most millennials and Gen Z also are getting their news from social media. So we have our Instagram page at Blavity Politics and a daily newsletter where you can get, stuff that's not just what's going on in Russia, but other news that you can go to. If you go to our website at Blavity, you can sign up for.
And so if the next 2 questions could both be asked, and then we'll let them answer it and wrap up.
All right. So my question is this. I was paying attention during the last election to issues relating to voting machines, to jurisdictions closing down and limiting the number of polling locations within the states, to secretaries of state putting misinformation on their websites about where to vote. And in Florida, the problems of where they placed the gubernatorial selection at the bottom of the page so that people missed it, and then Broward County not turning in votes on time to be counted. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that in Broward County it's Democrats that run that election office. And in places where everything's run by Republicans, maybe there's nothing we can do, but isn't there something we can do about making our Democratic election officials competent to count the damn fucking votes? Excuse my language. That's my question.
Yeah, and we'll just get yours, and then we'll have them answer both of them.
This question is for John, but it's a basic question about the way the campaigns go. Hillary had a lot of different positions and so on, and like you said, she was actually more progressive than people realized. Why don't they do what Trump did? You keep it very simple, like the basic KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. You have some key things that you want to push, and you may have other things, but keep the message simple. Then people will remember it. Versus most of her positions were lost in all the different things that she said. She said go to the website, but she had many different things in it, which were good for most people, even for people who were 55. Yeah. But it got lost. That's the basic thing. Yeah. It's got to be something people remember, like the ball.
Yes. No, I mean, look, it is. It's very. It's hopeful that, we've seen proposals like Medicare for All, like a Green New Deal, emerge over the last year or so. It's great because they are bold, progressive policies that will answer the challenges that we face. It's also great because they are simple, elegant policies that are easy to understand. I think as Democrats, it sometimes is very easy for us to, we like governing, right? That's our thing. Republicans don't like governing quite as much. And so we dig into our policy papers and our 10-point plans and our white papers, and we want to be responsible and make sure you pay for everything and that everything's incremental, that it works. And I get that, and I think there's a level of responsibility there that is important to have, and we shouldn't just be like make shit up like they make shit up. We don't need to do that. But I do think that you're right. We can have big policy ideas that are simple, elegant, easy to understand, and then hammer those home. Now look, the challenge is the media. The media does not like to cover your policies all that much. The media likes to cover the garbage that a lot of the media covers. And so it's a challenge. And so I think Democratic communication strategies has to figure out ways to go around traditional media sometimes and to get their message out. Dan Pfeiffer always says this. It's like, if you're a communications director on a Democratic campaign, 20% of your job should be dealing with reporters, and 80% of your job should be figuring out how you get the message out in any way possible, in any medium possible. And I think that the next Democratic candidate should probably do that.
And I think you're seeing that happen right now with the new sort of politicians that have just kind of taken, who have just, won. They're definitely being schooled and learned in social media, and you saw that with AOC and the Where's Mitch, and how that really started trending and catching on, and people started making memes. And I think really Trump was good at using social media in the same way that Barack Obama was really good at using social media in 2008. And I think Dems kind of lost that in 2016, and now you're definitely seeing more, even with the Cardi B video, and then Chuck Schumer and other senators being like, should I retweet it? That was them trying to catch on to engage. And so I think you're seeing sort of that branding of more just directly going to the people and kind of trying to miss out on the echo chamber of the media happening now.
And I don't want to miss this question about our Democrats making sure they are running elections right.
Yeah, I mean, if we have a Democrat in charge of local elections and they're, coming up with ballots where people can't figure out who to vote for, they shouldn't be in that job. we should make sure that we have Democratic election officials who are doing a good job. Yes. Broward County, man. Oof. It's always something.
So we're going to wrap up there, but if you could just give our panelists one more round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming out tonight.